I think we're at this point now where people need to know more about who he was.
Anybody who's ever gotten to know my dad absolutely adored him.
As soon as we actually started spending time together, I knew within like 2 weeks that he was the guy that I was going to be with. And I think we really balanced each other out. So yeah, I like hardcore pursued him.
I think that was kind of the defining thing of your guys' relationship, and what made it so special is that you really were ride or die for each other.
And he was a person who always had my back.
I mean, he was a total dad. He made dad jokes all the time. He made fun of me all the time.
Those versions of you, those versions of me, they didn't exist anymore after your dad died. But I think that goes to speak to, how much of a stabilizing anchor and force your dad was in our family. Hey, how's it going?
It's going.
Well, let's just catch up because it's you've been gone and
Yeah, I was on a pretty awesome trip. Um, took my motorcycle out to Yellowstone and through the Grand Tetons and everything like that, um, along with some friends, and it was a good time. It was a good
yeah.
time.
If you guys hear the whining in the background, it's Isaac's dog Charlie who likes I don't know. Anyway.
He wants to go sit out on the balcony. The problem is he likes to bark at neighbor dogs if they walk by, and so
Yeah.
he'll be even more loud if I let him out.
Yeah. So, I'm curious, what I would love to hear from people that are listening to us is, you know, to start give I mean, we've gotten some feedback about the podcast from various people, um, and a few reviews from people as well that have been really positive, which is great to hear. Um, some of the stuff that I thought was really nice and sort of, uh goes along with kind of what our original intentions were. I mean, when we started the podcast, the purpose of it was to not only like honor your dad and tell his story and tell our story at the same time, but also hopefully along the way, part of our journey, the things that we've dealt with and like our perspectives on life and mental health and the stuff that happens that hopefully something would resonate with other people and be helpful for them. And I think we're starting to or have been doing that. We've gotten some feedback from a few people who've lost someone, and this has been helpful. I've had
Also, people who haven't gone through this sort of thing and find
mhm,
it very enlightening, to kind of.
yeah, and then also some other people that just have their own struggles or battles with whether it's mental health or family situations or relationships have commented on this being helpful. So like I really appreciate that. I mean, I think that was ultimately our goal was to try to find some commonality with people and also help. I don't know, like it's easy to feel really isolated in this world and feel like what you go through is like very unique to you
Like
and
you're
yeah.
Yeah, like you're the only one dealing with it.
Right. And I think we all deal with stuff and maybe we deal with stuff differently, but like we all are human. We have the human experience and we live in a pretty crazy world. And so I think normalizing a lot of the just feelings that come along with some of the stuff that we experience has been interesting. So I love the feedback that we've been getting. I also I think my ask for anyone who is enjoying our podcast is to share this with people that you think might enjoy it as well. Um, I think anytime you're starting a podcast and you're like independent and not working with some big network, the challenge is always just getting it out there. And so, if you're enjoying this, share it with people that you think would enjoy it as well.
Yeah, all of those things that people say anytime you listen to a podcast or watch a YouTube video or any of those things, where it's like, you know interact with the video as much as you can, share it with as many people, because that stuff genuinely does help us to be able to actually do this more.
Yeah, when I watched things before on social media, or like YouTube, or even, when I did listen to podcasts, I didn't really realize like how much that made a difference for people. And it's not even about like it's more about the more interaction you get on the various platforms, the more the podcast or the content gets shared by that particular platform. So it's more about if you feel that what you're hearing is helpful or you're really enjoying, the thing that Isaac and I have going on, just by like liking, commenting, sharing, following, doing all of that stuff, it shows that people are engaged. And so then the various platforms start to highlight, the various episodes so that other people can potentially find the podcast as well. So besides sharing, those are the only other things that are helpful. And then giving us feedback. And the feedback's for us. I mean, so I think one of the things Isaac and I have been talking about is like additional content. And I know that eventually when we're done telling the story, we foresee in the future this podcast evolving into something um more topical, and really just kind of starting to touch on some of the things that are interesting and like we're passionate about, in terms of mental health or relationships. I think a lot of people find yours and I's relationship very interesting, and how we manage that, because I don't think that you see a lot of parent-child relationships like ours. Um,
Yeah, it's
so
fairly uncommon, even among my friends and whatnot.
right? Um, but we've worked hard on that, and I'm happy to talk about things outside of this particular journey, um, and offer that as content as well. Eventually we want to get into that more regularly, but if obviously our purpose in starting this conversation and this particular podcast and journey and story was there's a purpose behind it, and it might not be completely apparent now, but as the story unfolds, you'll understand really why we felt so strongly about sharing this story, and just the journey of like what we've experienced. But I mean, ultimately, the feedback and getting ideas from you guys is like what kind of things that you would like to hear us talk about, or like, situations or topics or things like that. That's helpful as well.
Yeah, yeah, share as much as you can, and give us feedback in um, the comments or in reviews or anything like that as well.
And if
Um,
you hate it, just don't don't say anything. If you don't like it, just, don't. Yeah. No, I'm
just
just
move on.
kidding.
Um, Speaking of kind of getting back into the story, I think kind of next I think we should just kind of share, what Eric, what my dad was like. So maybe let's start with how did you guys meet? How did you start dating? You know,
Yeah, I mean,
tell me about him.
I think we're at this point now where people need to know more about who he was, right? For the story to continue to make sense. I met your dad. Well, I kind of knew your dad my almost my entire life. My family, or I shouldn't say my family, my mom started she had like religion hopped when we were little. Um I think I don't know, I think she honestly has been like a part of 50 bazillion different religions, up into up until I was about 5 or 6. And so she found, a particular faith that she was really interested in. And when I was little, we started regularly attending those services. And Eric is a part of the same faith, and he also attended the same congregation that we did. the funny thing about your dad is that he's had a crush on me, or he had a crush on me. It's so hard not to talk about him in present tense. Do you find that hard? I feel like I talk as if he's still here.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think for me, I've probably experienced. I probably it seems as though I've experienced more life with him not here. That like it feels like I've lived a whole lifetime, and that's just I think kind of my age of when he passed, like coming to fruition, and that it's only been 5 years, but it's like very transformative years for me.
Yeah. Well, 5 years is a long time. I mean, in your
Right, but
lifespan.
especially when you're going 18 to your mid 20s, that's a very
Yeah.
very particular 5 years that
So
changes a lot in your
you
life.
find yourself talking more about him in past tense when you talk about him?
Yeah, I'm kind of at this weird point where like I miss our family and I miss my dad very much, obviously, but it feel like to me a lot of that stuff, as much as it has impacted like my direction in life and impacted every aspect of my life, it also feels like a lifetime ago that I actually was with dad, like that he
Yeah.
was my dad and that we would do things or interact or like it feels like so long ago that we were a family unit.
Yeah. I
And
mean, I feel that
you
sense
know
as well. Like, it feels like it was a long time ago and a whole lifetime has been.
so I don't really have a struggle with talking about him in the past tense, because to me that was a quarter of my life ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I do talk about him and
It at this point feels so long ago that
yeah.
all of this happened, and yet it also feels like it was yesterday.
Mhm.
It's a weird thing.
It's very
It's
strange.
like I said, so much has happened in my life since that. Um, so much that I mean, my entire adult life has happened since that. So a lot
Yeah.
has changed for me.
Yeah. I go
Not
back.
that it hasn't for you too, but
It really has. Eventually, we'll get to a point where we probably will bring, Jim on, who is my current husband, and talk kind of about that whole process and, um but yeah, I mean, it does feel like a whole lifetime ago, but it also feels like it was just yesterday. Um, I find that I go back and forth. I think it depends on, like, what I'm talking about, whether or not I'm talking past tense or present tense, but I do tend to talk about him as if he is still here. I mean, in a present tense, not like as he's here, because obviously he's not, but, like, I don't talk about him, in past tense very often. I have to catch myself sometimes because especially if I'm talking to people who know that I'm remarried, it can get a little confusing. um, but so back to your dad. He had a crush on me forever.
yeah. So he had really liked you from the time he met you at like what 5 6 years old or something
Yeah.
like that,
Yes.
and then into your teenage years he kind of
He had a crush on me since I started going to our congregation. Huge crush on me. I honestly didn't really know he existed until I was like 17. I mean, I knew who he was, but we didn't like hang out in the same circles. Um, our families weren't friends necessarily. Um, yeah, I mean, it just until you become a teenager, I don't know, you don't really hang out with a lot of kids on a regular basis. And I grew up with siblings and my family, they kind of, I guess, kept to themselves in some ways. Um, so
it's
outs
always interesting, I think, in that manner of like you know it sometimes when like when somebody you don't really realize who notices you, and
yeah,
vice versa. It's like he obviously took a notice of you right away, knew who you
yeah,
were, probably knew a lot more about you than you did of him,
oh, absolutely,
and you were just oblivious to it. And it's
completely,
like being in that spot, like it's a crush, right? So
yeah,
it's like um it is interesting though being on the other side of that where it's like I had no idea you existed and I was a big part of your world, I guess, you know?
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing about that dynamic, so when I was little, um, up through teenagerhood and, until I started dating her dad, I literally had a crush on, like, almost everyone. Like, I was one of those girls that very easily had a crush on somebody. It didn't matter. I didn't, like, date really, though, when I became a teenager. I mean, I didn't, um yeah, I didn't really have, like, a lot of boyfriends or anything like
You're
that.
really missing that that attention at home, huh?
Right. I just I just always I had a crush on
Seeking it
somebody.
out from all the boys.
Yeah, except I never talked to any of them. I just had a crush from afar. I just always had crushes on
You
people,
just
so
like to live in your mind.
pretty much. I had a crush on his best friend at the time growing up, which was I thought funny. And your dad and I used to joke about it later on. um but yeah, yeah, he's had a crush on me since I was like since I since he knew me. And then I had a crush on his best friend for a long time. I dated when I was like 15. I think, yeah, 15. I kind of had like I dated, I don't know, like I guess at 15 do you really date? Nowadays you do, but back then, I mean, I don't know how much of dating it was, but I had a really good friend and we were like boyfriend and girlfriend when I was like 15. Um who was also friends. Like, when you start to become in the teenage years, kind of like in high school too, I think. But ironically, I was homeschooled. I did a year in 7th grade, and then I went back to school, and then when I was in 9th grade, I was like, "I don't wanna be here," so I started homeschooling in 9th grade. So, like, my core group of friends primarily were people that who were part of my faith, who were in my congregation. We had a lot of teenagers, around, not all exactly the same age, but within a few years of each other on either side, that we had, like, a decent group of friends there. So I spent a lot of time with all of these people when I was growing up. Neither here nor there. I had a really dysfunctional, tumultuous, turmoil, I don't know, type family situation. So I spent as much time away from home as possible when I was a teenager. And so the boyfriend I had, when I was around 15, he was my best friend at the time. I spent literally every day at his house. Like, I didn't spend the night at his house, but I spent every day at his house. And his mom kind of was like a maternal figure to me during that time from like 15 to 16. Um because I couldn't be at home. I mean, literally, I think until I moved out at 17, my mom and I fought every single day. And so I spent a lot of time with.
If I remember that story properly, is this the same guy where, you were quote unquote boyfriend and girlfriend until he actually kissed you and you're like, No, no."
Yeah. Yeah, then I and I used to give
You're
him.
like, "Nah, I'm not into it. I'm not into it anymore." As soon
No,
as
yeah, exactly, and I was such a jerk. I, like, made fun of him for a long time after that because we were still friends after that. I was so I mean, he was mad at me for a while, but I used to give him a lot of crap. No, yeah, I mean, we only dated for, like, a few months, but really, like, yeah, he kissed me, and I think what I realized at that time is that, like, he just felt more like a brother to me than anything else, and so, um, yeah, so, that situation, yeah, I was never at home, at my house. I tried to not be there as much as possible. I had a lot of, like, people that I would spend time with out, just to get out of my house, and so I, moved out when I was 17 into an apartment with my best friend at the time, who was 3 years older than me, I think she was like 19 or 20 when I when I was 17. So, um, we'd gotten an apartment together. Well, my best friend happened to be the sister of the the boy that I had a crush on when I was younger, and then he was best friends with your dad. So, really how your dad and I started spending a lot more time together was after I moved out into my apartment. Um, we're like the only teenagers that had apartments basically, or an apartment at the time. And so everybody would just come and hang out at our house. So like her brother, and then of course by extension your dad would come
Keep
hang
in
out.
mind, yeah, I mean, small town too, so
Oh
it
yeah,
was it was
super small town.
literally, yeah, everyone and their brother would come over, and you know, you're the only people with your own place, your own little privacy, so everybody would have just come
Yeah.
and hang out where you're at.
Yeah, people like to hang out. Um and so yeah, so I just started spending more time. I had also there was like another friend of ours that was quite a bit older, who also would have a lot of us over. She had an apartment. And so I did spend time with your dad there as well. But I don't know. It was after we moved into our apartment that I think I started to really take notice of him. And he, I don't know. As soon as we actually started spending time together, I knew within like 2 weeks that he was the guy that I was going to be with. Like I just knew. Um, Bear in mind that my situation growing up forced me to have a lot of maturity when I was very young. I was parentified, I guess is the word. Um, when I was very young, like 11, 12, I really had to step into like a parental type role, not only with my siblings, but also with my parents. And so I would say I was pretty mature for my age at a young age. And I was very, and even to this day, I mean, this is not shocking to anybody, but I really had strong opinions. I knew myself really well at that time. Um,
I
and
think
so,
I think I picked up a lot of that
I
in
mean,
general.
yeah, it's a good thing. I think as long as you continue to be open to learning more about yourself. So like not being stuck in like this is who I am, but I was always very self-aware of who I was in that moment of time. Um and
I think I just was saying that as like I resonate with that because I feel very similar. I don't obviously very different situation, but I've had to grow up quite quickly,
yeah.
and I've been very much
And our
um,
goal was not
I've
for
very
that to
much
happen.
known. Well, but I've very much known who I am and like been very confident in myself for a long time because of that. And I'm often, by most adults and most people that I've been around, like been told that I'm, you know, a bit more mature for my age, at least, especially back when I was a teenager.
Yeah. I think
Um,
some of that has to do with the fact that you're an only child as well. You know, I mean, you literally
Probably.
were around adults all the time.
Yeah, well, even as a later teenager, all of my friends were quite a bit older than me. I was always hanging around people in their 20s, and I
Yeah.
never really, like, I had friends who were my age, but I never really got along with a lot of the kids my age
Mhm.
because um I just, I don't know, a lot of times we would do stuff and I just didn't find it was dumb stuff and I just didn't find it as enjoyable,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think different reasons. You definitely had to grow up faster, especially after your dad died. Prior to that, being a teenager, I think a lot of that maturity for you just came from being an only child. I mean, we literally included you in everything. We didn't. Um, we obviously had a very communicative and open family, so like we didn't shield you from things or shelter you from what's going on in the world or in our world. So I think that constant exposure to adults and not, I don't know. So yeah, you were always fairly mature. So same thing.
I think I always just had a desire to be, have a very learning attitude when it came to the world
Yeah.
and just like how things work and to try to, I don't know. I don't know if I'm sure it's a whole whirlwind of circumstances that made me the way that I am, but I always remember like I resonated more with people who were older than me because I felt like they had something to teach me,
Yeah.
rather than people my age. I often often felt like I had to um I don't know if dumb myself down is the best word, but or the best way of saying it, but I felt like I had to limit myself to get along with people my age.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to that, and mine came obviously from having to literally grow up too fast. So
I
I
think a
I
lot of that, especially after dad died, is
yeah,
was a lot of that as well, where
yeah,
I was put in a position where nobody really understood me
yeah,
anymore.
yeah. No, I know you understand. I was so yeah. So when I say I like knew, I knew myself really well, and I don't know, I just knew after I had spent more one-on-one time with your dad. I was just like, I knew that he and I were going to be together. And the funny thing is that uh his mom, obviously your grandma, um really wanted me to be a part of, like, she wanted me to be with Eric. So
Shout
um
out to grandma.
and
We love you very much.
we do love you. And she, at the time, I still was, right now I'm pretty much no contact with my mom. But at the time when I was younger, obviously I was very enmeshed in my family, and I would say probably trauma bonded to my mom. Um, and so while my mom was very jealous of certain relationships I had with other older women, for some reason she also was really on this bandwagon of your dad and I getting together. So, and at the
So
time,
everybody liked you two as a couple.
yes,
You guys were very, I would say, because even dad, he kind of had an interesting upbringing as well.
yeah.
I think he was, you know,
He had a big
because
family.
his dad was, well, yeah, he came from a big family. He had what, five brothers and sisters, or six,
5. There were 6
five.
total.
Yeah, yeah,
Do math
he
in my
was
head.
he was right in the middle of the pack. Whereas you were the oldest of your siblings.
Yeah, although interestingly, he was, I think it was 6 years between him and his older, brother, and then 6 years between him and his younger brother. So,
Yeah, so he was
even
right in the middle, but he was very kind of alone because by the time
mhm,
he was a teenager, his older brother was out
mhm,
and his older sister was out.
yep,
And
and
then
then
he was in charge of taking care of all of his other siblings that were younger than him.
yep,
So
his parents had both worked full time, and they had to, they had to they lived out in the country, and so, yeah, I think Eric also was pretty mature for his age because he was responsible for these kids, his siblings when he was younger. And then he just in general was a pretty mature guy too. And I think that's probably part of what really why we really clicked the way that we did is we both were more mature for our age than like our surrounding group of, I don't know, people that we were around. Um so yeah, we started hanging out more, and I just kind of knew. And the funny thing about your dad is he had this crush on me since I was like 5. But at the particular time that we're like, I would say I started really like noticing him, he was kind of getting into some trouble as a teenager, as some teenagers do. And the crowd that he was hanging out with was maybe not like the best influence. And he was protective of me. So, like, he did not. So I knew that he had liked me at that point. And like, it wasn't a secret. But he didn't want, I think he felt like he wasn't good enough. Um, and I think that he also like didn't want me to be in like inadvertently get involved with like the crowd he was hanging out with, which I wouldn't have anyways because it wasn't like my thing. But so ironically, he started out having the crush on me forever, and then when I noticed him and was like, "I really like you," he was just like, "No." He, was then, trying everything he could to, like, make sure I wasn't interested because he didn't I think he just felt like I don't know, uh, it was something we used to talk about a lot in our relationship was just how, um he was in love with me forever, but, like, he also at the same time, like, I think didn't feel like he was good enough. He was kind of in mixed up in this stuff that, I think if he had continued down that path, who knows what have come out of that. He used to tell me all the time too that, like, um, he felt like I saved his life, that he would have not, gone down a good path himself if him and I had not started dating when we did and kind of gone down the path that we did. So, Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. He just your dad and you know your dad. He's unassuming in a certain way. He's we found out way after he died that he was like, he had some social anxiety that he's pretty introverted. Unless you know him really well. Then he was very extroverted, which I think is pretty normal for most introverted people is
I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but like I remember, a lot of people would be very intimidated by him or think that
Mhm.
that he didn't like them until they hung out a few times, and then he once he got comfortable around you,
Mhm.
everyone was like, "Oh, I love this guy." But
Yeah.
it was just until then he was very s- not quite standoffish, but like if you didn't know his vibe, I guess you didn't know how he interacted with people. People were
Yeah.
put off by his initial kind of impressions.
And that was the same when he was younger too, is people were very intimidated by him. I mean, he was like one of those teenagers that like you definitely didn't want to be getting in a fight with him. That was for sure. But he was like
I
not
also think I
go ahead.
also think that he was never really he didn't really ever care to like about the pleasantries to like get to know
Oh no.
you per
Mm-mm.
se.
And he didn't
Like
care technically.
people would be polite or like try to talk to him and make small talk, and he didn't like small talk. He also didn't like the small pleasantries or whatever. He was a bit more of a deeper guy where I don't really care and he didn't care um to like go out of his way to get to know somebody per
No.
se most of the time unless he really liked you. And so a lot of people find that off-putting because
Yeah.
they're like, "Oh, he does he's not putting in any effort, so he clearly doesn't like me." And it's like, "Well, no, he just doesn't care."
Yeah, he just well, I think, again, hindsight 2020, knowing more about his diagnosis of severe social anxiety, all of that makes sense, right? Like, if
Mhm.
you are so severely anxious in social situations, you are not gonna like the pleasantry, small talk part of getting to know somebody. Um, and, again, it's like one of those things that I wish I had known about him at when we were younger. I mean, I knew it. Obviously, I could see it in real time and what it was happening, but I didn't understand that that's what it was, right? Like so much of that becomes part of a person's personality that sometimes you don't realize that it might be more than that. And so
Right.
yeah, so and I think, everyone who was in your dad's inner circle absolutely adored him. But yeah, people were
Oh,
definitely
anybody who's ever gotten to know my dad
yeah,
absolutely adored him.
all of
It was
his
just that it was always just the first impressions because people would be like, you know, "Oh, he clearly doesn't like me," and it's like,
well, he
no,
always
he just doesn't,
yeah,
he doesn't he doesn't like the very beginning portion of any relationship, so he doesn't put any effort into that part. And
yeah,
so like people always had to come to him if they wanted to get to know him, basically. And then once they did, and once he got comfortable around you, he was a gem, diamond in the rough kind of deal.
I think that's where we really balance each other out because I was very extroverted when I was younger, and I also was used to being very I mean, all of my siblings are very close in age. We're all maybe a year and a half maximum apart from each other. Um, and so I grew up with two sisters and a brother. And so I just was a very extroverted person in general. And I think we really balanced each other out. So yeah, I like hardcore pursued him. And I remember part of it was him sort of thinking he wasn't good enough for me at the time. Part of it was also there was a girl that had like a crush on him that he was not um into or dating or doing anything like that, but she had some tendencies to um he was afraid that if he started to outwardly show interest in me that it would cause problems for me, I guess would be the best way to put it. Um so I just remember kind of getting to a point where I was just like, nope, this is going to happen because I think and this carried on I think through our relationship as we got older is I just could read him so well. So I knew what might be getting in the way, and I also knew that, like, sometimes he would hold himself back because of, whether it was anxiety or other things, and so then I would just sort of push forward, and I think that's where we balanced each other out really well. The thing I think, as I've gotten to know myself better, as I've spent more time unpacking, like, my family stuff and, the way I grew up and stuff, I came from a really, really chaotic, upbringing. My household was extremely chaotic, and, your dad for me was really grounding. He was a very safe space for me.
Well, I think that's very common, in terms of people with a lot of trauma, or growing up in a chaotic household. Is either they look for love in that same level of chaos, which is how
Mhm.
you end up in abusive relationships and
Yep.
like settling for things that aren't quite right for you, and that's um, usually a case of you look for the love that you've been given, so that's all you know, right?
Right.
And then love or a relationship that actually treats you better feels uncomfortable because it's not what you're used to.
It can be, yeah.
and then
Or
on the and
yeah.
then on the other hand, or it pushes people to search for stability because they don't have that at home, so they're
Yeah.
looking for something to stabilize them. um, you know and it's interesting how that kind of tends to be a dichotomy a lot,
Yeah.
where it's like either you go one way or the other. And even, I would say, even with trauma in general, like with what I've gone through, a lot of people will either go one way or the other. They'll either go um, where they regress, or they stay kind of at that same level whenever that event happened, or they go the opposite direction, they have to grow up fast and they become very mature. And it really depends on the person and the situation, but like I've seen it a lot of times where people my age go through something very traumatic, and then they never grow out of that state. They just kind of stay in that one mentality for forever,
I
and they
think
don't
that
really grow a lot from it.
yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with, like, what support systems you have, right? So,
Yeah,
if you don't have a lot of support systems or if you have an environment that continues to re-traumatize you and you never really get out of that for a long time, I think that's where a lot of people get stuck. But if you have a
I
good
think it's not just like the support system either. I think it's also um, you know whether or not they have enough pressure to do to come out of it. They say pressure makes
yeah,
diamonds, right? So it's like if you have a traumatizing event, but you're able to just sit in that instead of being forced by something to you know
right.
move on, um and to get better, and that kind of force can be different for everybody. But there's
Yeah.
also, if you're able to just sit in it, kind of our natural tendency is to do so.
Well, and resources. So again, it's like support system, resources, it's partially genetics and your personality. So, I mean, that's very true with me. I am not really much like my family at all. I grew up in the same environment, but I have slightly different genetics. And so, um, I think those things all play a role, and it's kind of a mishmash of all of that. But yeah, I was initially, I think, really, your dad was a very stable person. He was very strong, willed, which
Stubborn. He was very
extremely
stubborn.
stubborn. Oh, stubborn to the fact that it was frustrating at times as we got older. Like when I was younger, um, that that strong will and that stubbornness actually really helped me. Um, but yeah, I pursued him. We started dating, and I think we started dating in like April, and then in 1998, and we were married by December of 1998. And now again, I did know him in a sense, like my almost my entire um childhood. But yeah, we didn't date super long. I think we were engaged like a couple months after we started dating. But when you know, you know. And we just knew. And I think this is a very indicative thing of your dad is he again probably comes back to some of the anxiety that he experienced, but he was not like a he didn't put on any sort of like not show, but like people would say like, "Oh,
He
well,
didn't
how."
put on a front or anything.
Well, I mean, like, he wasn't he didn't like attention. So, if you think about people are like, "Well, how did he propose?" Well, he didn't do anything crazy because like, he didn't want that attention. So, I mean, literally, I think we were, like, cuddling on the couch, and it was sort of like, "So, do you want to? Do you wanna get married?" So, like, it wasn't anything, um, there was no big grand gesture, nothing like that. And that was very much, I think, indicative of his personality. And at the time for me, like, I had enough personality and enough, like, extrovertedness to probably cover, multiple, people. So, we
Well, and
really
that
balanced each
was the
other out.
thing. Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that's the thing that he really found captivating about you is that you drew him out of his comfort zone.
Oh, I didn't even
And
draw him. I, like, literally pushed him out of his comfort zone all the time.
right. Well, and I know as much as he hated that, he also loved it,
And he
And
needed
so it
it.
was, yeah. But I think he was very captivated by you just in your kind of energy versus him, where he, again, like you said, he was very much, um, he was a lot more quiet and reserved, and like he didn't like the attention like you said. So
Mm-mm.
he was a very funny guy, so he would make comments in the background, and if you weren't paying attention,
Oh,
it would go right
those
over your head.
one-liners.
Yeah,
Just
but anybody who knew him and paid attention to him were like, if you were, I don't think he was very introverted, but I think a lot of that came from he didn't view himself as very important.
yeah. I think that that's true, and I think a lot of the introversion came from the social anxiety. Again, all of this is stuff that I didn't know at the time. We didn't know, as we'll continue to kind of explain until after he died. Um, but it explains a lot of like his personality and why he was the way he was. Um, but yeah, he was really stable, and what I thought was so one thing I will say about Eric is that like we grew up together, so I think, when you lose a spouse, it's so hard to explain that type of loss because it's multiple losses. It's not like I just lost this person who I was married to, who was my husband, who I was in love with, but he was my best friend, my family, and then we had created a family together. So like I grew up with him. Like I had been with him since I was 17, and we got married and we had a child together and we became a unit, and he was a person who always had my back. So I came from a very unstable, very chaotic family background where I often fulfilled the role of the bad guy. Like bad guy and me are very synonymous, in my familial situation, and so, um and with him, I he just he, like, adored me, and he always had my back. So, he was the person that taught me how to stand up for myself, because the person that I am today, I was not like this when I was a teenager. I mean, I was very opinionated, and I had a lot of, things that I was, some strengths, the maturity, but I was terrified of confrontation. Like, I didn't do well with it.
That was the one thing with dad. I think that was very important is because he had this like attitude where he just didn't really care what people thought of him.
Even though
Because
he
he didn't
probably
really
really did.
yeah, but he was never afraid of confrontation or
Mm-mm.
anything like that. Like
But he didn't.
he was very reserved and quiet, but like
Mhm.
he was not afraid to he was not afraid to be the one to confront any situation if it
Or put
needed
his foot
confronting.
down, or yeah,
Oh
and
yeah.
he didn't go looking for it, and it took a lot to get him to a point where he would get upset about something, but once he got to that space.
I feel like scapegoat um is a better name for how your family treated you more so than I mean it was bad guy as well, but like I feel like you would step in and try to help with a lot of things
Mhm.
and you would help, but you would put in boundaries with dad's help. And then when people cross those boundaries, he would help you kind of prevent that and oftentimes your family wouldn't respect that and then they'd call you the bad guy because they crossed your boundaries.
Yeah, and I would argue too that my boundaries have been an ever evolving thing. Like, he was the person who helped me learn that having boundaries was a good thing. I remember when we were first married, I mean, he was the person that would say to me, like, when you grow up in a small bubble, of a dysfunctional and chaotic family, that's all you know. And you don't necessarily realize that some of the stuff that's going on is not okay or not normal or not healthy, until you start to get distance from it. And then once you get distance from it and you start to see it, you're like, oh, yeah, this isn't normal, or like maybe this isn't okay, or this isn't how other people treat each other. And so for me, he was that person, not only because I mean, I moved out when I was 17. So it's not like he got me out of that situation in the sense, but like I still was very enmeshed even though I had moved out. He was the
Well, it's still
person.
your family.
Yeah, and he was the person that just really, and he wasn't, like, intrusive about it. It wasn't like he was like, "You need to do whatever with your family." It was more just that he really started to point out things to me that were like he's like, that's not, like, okay for, you know, this to
Yeah, he
happen or
he would
that to
observe
happen."
and bring it to your attention.
Mhm.
He would observe how they treated you, and he'd be like, "Hey, that's not normal. That's not
And it's just not
okay."
okay, and it's because he loved me, so, like, he also was very
Right.
protective of me, like, he did not put up with, other people treating me badly, and, for me, I needed that. I needed somebody who was in my corner.
So yeah, very much so. I think that's always a um, interesting thing in general too, because oftentimes I think I've witnessed in relationships a lot where, especially with my friends and stuff, where confronting, your significant other's family is a whole different thing,
Yeah.
right? Because the family has, typically obviously much more history with that person, but also, they almost feel like they have a right to treat them however they want because they're family.
Mhm.
And so I've seen with a lot of my friends in their relationship. Well, not I shouldn't say a lot, but I've seen in certain friends growing up that when they get into a relationship that's serious, they're still afraid to confront things with family members because they don't want to step on any
Yeah.
toes or whatever. And it's like, well, if you kind of are in that level of relationship, um, where you're seeing that like you want you think your partner should be treated in a certain way, it's okay to help set up those boundaries.
Yeah, and I think, also I wanted that. I
Right.
recognize that the dynamic that existed was not healthy. And so I just didn't always know how to have the strength or the ability to like always keep the boundary or put my foot down. And your dad was the person who really taught me how to do that. And he also taught me to do that because he was always a safe space to land. Like I always knew no matter what happened, he had my back 100%.
Well, and I guess the important thing is that he never forced it on you. He
Mm-mm.
was just a support system for you to do
Mm-hmm.
it on your own.
Yep.
But he did observe those things and point some of them out to you and say, like, is that really how you deserve to be treated?
Right.
Is that really how you want to be treated? And if you don't want to be treated this way, I'm
Mm-hmm.
always here for you
Mm-hmm.
to land on. So you're not alone in trying to face that with yourself,
I remember
with
the
your
first
family or whatever.
Yeah, I remember the first couple times that I confronted, I don't know, friends or I had a lot of dysfunctional friendships too at the time, obviously, because I came from a dysfunctional family system. So like I didn't understand like what a healthy friendship looked like either.
like
And
like I said before, when you come from chaos, you seek chaos a lot of times
yeah,
until you find somebody who helps bring you out of it. You have some
right.
sort of support to bring you out of it.
But I remember, like, after we got married, and I remember sitting in, like, our first apartment, and, like, there was a person, that was not treating me well, and I just remember being and it was an adult, so it wasn't I mean, technically, I was an adult at that point too, but I was still 18, and I think this person was, like, in her 40s or something, and I just remember being so terrified, but, like, this person was not treating me well and was being just she was not she was crossing boundaries. And I remember being like, I just want to be able to tell her that this is not okay. And like, I'm not going to accept this anymore. But I've never done that before, ever. Um, and so I was so terrified. And I remember your dad, like, he literally he sat with me as I'm like terrified getting on this phone call to sort of have this confrontation slash conversation with this person to start setting boundaries. And he just was there. He always was just there, and he always had my back, and that continued even after we had you. We were always
I think
united.
I think that was kind of the defining thing of your guys' relationship, and what made it so special is that you really were ride or die for each other.
Mhm.
Like, you really were. He always, even if he disagreed with your behavior, or how, or what was going on, he always had your back in the moment.
Yeah.
And he always was just supportive. So, like, he never really took your battles for you, but he was there to
Mhm.
to help you if and when you needed it, just to be somebody to lean on. And I think that's, first of all, I think that's a very important kind of thing to have in a relationship, where you're
Yeah.
very supportive of each other, because that's ultimately what all of us need and want. But
Yeah.
I think that's also a very special thing about your relationship, is that
Yeah.
you never really had to worry about trust or support or anything like that. You always just took care of each other.
Yeah. No, we never did. And we both were secure in the relationship, so we both were free to be who we were, and, again, um, we had a lot of growing. I would say that your dad, he grew a lot, but he also stayed, pretty consistent. I think because of the environment I came from and then just my own personality of constantly pushing to be better and evolving like mental health wise and like emotionally. I think I went through a lot of really big changes when I was younger, as I continued in my own, journey. And your dad, he just kind of rolled with the punches. Like he loved who I was at the core, and like even though like I probably had like 50 different career paths that I was trying to follow, I was like early
Well,
20s. Like,
he was very much like your biggest fan, and he was your biggest supporter and all those things.
mhm.
And so he was always the person who just wanted you to be you.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'll just take care of it. I'll make sure that
Yeah.
he was always the one who took care of everything to give you the platform you know, to grow the way that you wanted to.
Yeah, he was.
And he was comfortable. He was very comfortable just with his life, like having us and
He
as a
liked
family,
routine.
and allowing you to, yeah,
Yeah,
and allowing you to do what you wanted to do. And
yep. He liked things to be, and that, I mean, makes sense again, because the reason I was attracted to him is he was a very stable, grounding presence, and he liked his routine. He liked things, to not change all the time. Um, and I think that's where
you
we
are very
balance.
much the opposite of that.
Right? And that's where we balance each other out. And me, I don't know that I necessarily like things to change all the time. It's just what I knew. And that's, what I experienced in life. Things were never
I think
stable.
ultimately, though, I don't think that's really changed. All things considered, I think you've gotten a lot more used to it, and you've learned how to do it effectively and
Yeah.
maybe a little bit more efficiently. But I don't think you're seeking out change all the time has really changed all that much.
I don't I don't know that I necessarily seek it out. I just am okay with it. So like I'm okay with making a change if I feel like an opportunity arises or,
But
something new.
I think the difference though is that you're okay. You've become so comfortable with change that you're okay making a change if it presents itself. But I think you also tend to seek opportunity
Yeah.
and to seek growth. And
Yeah.
so because of that, when you come across something that you're like, oh, this might be good, you're willing to pull the trigger like that, whereas most people are not.
Right.
Um, and so in a way, you still do seek out change a lot. It's just a bit more purposeful
Yeah.
on your part rather than just kind of going in blindly.
Yeah.
But I think you're so comfortable with it that you just end up doing it all, doing it a lot. I mean, even after Dad died, there was a lot of things that continued to change and
Well, I mean, it got worse. I would say for a while, there was a consistency to the type of change and growth that I had. But like when your dad died, I mean, literally when everything in your life that exists changes in an instant. I mean, the best way I can describe losing someone you've been married to for 19 years and together with 20 years, who's your family, your best friend, and everything, is it literally feels like you all of a sudden woke up in an alternate universe. Like everything looks the same, but it's not. And everything's different. Every single aspect of my life was different, just like that.
well, and
And
I
so after
think
that,
um,
change is not that scary anymore because literally everything changed in that moment. Everything in my life changed. So
right.
then,
Well, I think
change
I
gets
think
more.
to I think to that event, probably kind of. Well, I think you mentioned this in a previous episode already, where you had said you had issues with like anxiety and panic attacks, and you were finally getting to a good spot where you felt good and you were doing good on those fronts. And then he died, and it felt like a big setback for you. I think that also was a setback in your own personal journey growth wise and stuff,
Mhm.
because um you, as you just said, you were very much on a steady path, or a steady continuous path of growth. But it was a lot more pointed and purposeful.
Yeah.
And then I think after he died, you got set back in a way where you're like, well, now all of my plans have changed
Everything's
instantly.
different. So
So now I
everything's,
have to reassess and redo everything
yep.
about my life.
And the
You have
whole
to start
everything's
you had to
open.
start over
Yeah.
essentially.
Like the
Right.
whole, it's kind of like, I think I felt a lot, during those periods after he died, was sort of like a teenager who's gonna be 18 and literally can
Just
choose
I
whatever they're
think
gonna do, and you're like, "Okay, what
I
do I
think
do?"
oddly Yeah, I think oddly you and I were in a very similar position after
Yeah.
he died, because we both were back to, like, I was already there in life, but I think you got set back to that same kind
Mhm.
of point of, now I have to figure out what to do with my life, because for me it was just general coming of age growth type stuff, but for you it was, it's not like you had a plan B for if dad was no longer here. Like your plan was him. Your plan was to spend your lives together, and that got blown up. And even on the path you were on before he died, in terms of your growth, and you were back in school, going to nursing school, trying to start this new career, like you were still doing that with, the notion in your mind of building a life with my dad, or continuing to build a
Right.
life with my dad.
Yeah.
And so having that setback of like, oh, now I have to figure out how to build a life for myself again
Yep.
without him.
Yep.
Um, it was kind of odd that you and I ended up in a very similar
Yeah.
position. Um,
And I think it made it really difficult for you because you're trying to figure stuff out, and then I'm what you knew to be what had been stable and consistent for you was also different, and even just with
well, I was
me.
gonna I was gonna say I think that's also part of it for me. You had said earlier that you and dad tried really hard to minimize the chaos in my life.
Mhm.
After he died, though, that's all it was,
And it was
because
for me too.
I know I know it was, but I
Yeah.
also no longer had the stability that I was used to. Everything
Yeah.
got thrown into chaos, and I just had like, I got thrown with adulthood. I got thrown into the deep end of the pool right away,
Yeah. You
because it was
totally
like the
did.
second I turned 18, I was on my own, and like in a lot of ways.
On your own
Uh,
in an emotion I would say in some emotional and, like, mental ways, you weren't on your own, like, you
well,
know.
I mean, I had physical support,
Yeah.
um, but I had to navigate the world, and I had to navigate, my own internal self. Um, I would say by myself in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. I had various support systems, and I had, people from our congregation, and I did have you, and I did have, but I didn't have you in the way that I was used to.
Yeah.
It
And the
was
th
a very different. It was a very different you, and
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, that's okay. But like I said, half of what I knew in my world was gone,
Yeah.
because I pretty much, like, I knew you guys, and um and then you had changed completely, like
Well, not
almost.
completely. I think there's some things that were very consistent, but I mean, everything in my life was different, so of course, I
Well, like I said, you know you were still very much you, but we didn't have dad to be dad. He was no longer a stabilizing force for you, and he was no longer a buffer for us, because we are so similar.
Mhm.
And so I think that was,
Well, yeah, and we'll
ulti-
talk more about, like, I think that stuff specifically, but yeah, I mean, I think, you know, unfortunately, that's the byproduct of something super traumatic happening, and I think,
Mhm.
you know, I think both you and I have.
Everybody's trying to deal with it at the same time, and
Yep,
circumstances of life, and all the
and
things that you can't control.
everyone feels isolated because again we were going through a similar loss, but like we both were very much dealing with our own things, and these were things that other people couldn't necessarily like help us with or deal with. you know we had a great support system all around, but yeah, it was a very isolating time. But kind of back to your dad,
Well, and
I
I get. I was just gonna say, I guess my main point with kind of going into that is that, for me, that moment, I kind of lost stability, because you
yeah.
know um you know in the same way that you had lost stability.
Hmm.
And so it's weird that we were both in a very similar position, because um we were both kind of on our own journeys with dealing with all of it.
Yeah,
Not that we weren't there for each other, but we weren't there for each other in the ways that we had been used to, because normally we had a
because it's
third party.
well, and that those people didn't exist anymore. You know what I mean? Like, even those versions of you, those versions of me, they didn't exist anymore after your dad died. And so,
Right. Well, we were different. Like, honestly, I think I was a very different person, than I am now, and I think you were also,
mhm,
in a lot of ways, very different when he was with us.
yeah.
Than in the aftermath of it, which goes to show how really who you spend your time with really impacts who you tend to be as a person,
Yeah. I
which
mean,
is
I
an
think
interesting thought as well.
yeah, and I think the interesting thing is that there's a lot about, like, choices I've made and things that I'm doing now that are very much a part of my core personality, but when you get married and you have a family and, you know, you make those choices, there are a lot of things that you maybe would be naturally inclined to do or would do if you were single and by yourself that you don't do because you're working towards a specific goal as a family, right? Like I had you and your dad. I mean, we had you. We had specific things that we wanted to make sure we provided, as parents in terms of, support and love and helping you, grow in like having emotional intelligence and navigating the world and um understanding human behavior and things that like I don't know, like I wish I'd known a little bit better when I was younger, navigating relationships. So, there were a lot of things that I was inclined to, or like if it was totally up to me, I would have done that. You didn't get to see that. Your dad knew that about me, but you didn't get to see that because that's not where we're at. I was your mom, you had your dad. We were, focused on what was best for you, and us as a family, not what was best for Susie. And so I think some of the things that I've done now post loss are not necessarily a different me. It's just a part of me that hasn't been expressed for a long time because there are things, about my personality that, are journeys that I would have taken, probably if I had never got married, like certain decisions that I made.
Well, and again, I think that was kind of the catalyst, like you were saying, of when we got put into that same kind of situation. You know, I think for me there was that moment where you kind of went off and were became a little more focused on like, okay, what am I gonna do now? My plans are all blown up. What's my plan B? And so you kind of started going in all these different directions, trying to figure out your life again. Um, which again, for me as like the
Mhm.
17-year-old, it's like, okay, well now I don't. You became more of who you are as an individual with me, and less of a mom role very quickly. I would
Yeah.
say
You also
in a
pushed for
lot of
that though, because
ways.
you were almost 18 when your dad died.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
pushed
I
hard
think.
for that though.
Well, I was pushing hard for
Yeah.
that until dad died, and then I realized, well, I actually still need. Well, I guess I didn't really realize this until much later, but I
Yeah, I was gonna
did
say because
still.
you pushed pretty hard for really starting to have that separation, which I was totally supportive of because I think
Right,
it's necessary. But yeah, it was
right.
it was a
I
hard
think.
time. It was a hard time
Yeah,
because
it was one of those things where it was just because of the circumstances, it pushed me in a direction to. I think I was very focused on finding my own way,
yeah.
um, because I didn't really. Part of it was because I wanted to, and I've always been an independent kind of spirit, and part of it is because I didn't really see any other options.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think either of us really had a lot of options. We just kinda were out there without the life vest, sort of trying to, like, swim and not
Yeah,
sink,
yeah.
after that whole situation. But I think that goes to speak to, how much of a stabilizing anchor and force your dad was, in our
Oh yeah,
family. And,
yeah. I mean, he was. Oh man, I like we were so incredibly close all throughout my childhood into
yeah,
my
I mean,
teenage
what do you
years. We
remember
we
about your
would.
dad?
I mean, he was always very good at being playful with me, and like that's one of the things that I appreciated a lot as we
Yeah,
were,
you doorknob.
especially as a kid. He would call me names like that all the time, but we would wrestle and we would go
Mhm.
fishing and we would, play catch and like I mean, he was a total dad. He made dad jokes all the time. He
Oh,
made fun of me
he
all the
was
time and
the
he
king of dad jokes. King of dad
yeah.
jokes.
Yep.
Except I can't
One-liners
remember
and
any of them.
deadpans and yeah, it's tough. That's the one thing that's kind of disappointing is it's tough to remember the details of all
Mhm,
those little things that you take for granted every day. Um, but I remember when I was little and we used to live at that house, we would go catfishing under the bridge all the time on the river,
mhm.
and that was one of the
Pictures,
standing
yeah.
points in my memory. And camping up
Yep.
on family land, and then
Every year
uh,
we went camping. That was kind of like an
you know,
annual
and then
tradition.
yeah, and going up to the North Shore, doing that sort of thing for family trips. And like I always remember he would come down, he would come into my room just at random times. I'd be doing my thing. And this was always indicative, looking back, this was indicative of kind of the way he loved me, but he would just want to come and hang out with me for a
Mhm.
while. Like, and especially when I became a teenager, I tended to get a little more annoyed with him because I wanted to do my own thing.
Yeah.
And he would come in and be like, "Oh, what are you up to? Like, let me hang out with you." And I'd be like, "No, I'm in the middle of something. Like,
Yeah.
go away."
He absolutely adored you. I,
Yeah. And,
God.
he, I don't know. I think he was such a, I mean, he taught me everything, most of the things that I know. He was very good at, like, encouraging or allowing me to, again, kind of find my own path, and, like, just encouraging me to do the things
Mhm.
that I enjoy. But he was also where I got my sense of humor from, and where I learned how to be handy and fix stuff, and like all of that.
Cooking, your dad
I
was al he's the cook in our family.
Mhm.
You guys used to cook together when you got, a little bit older into the teenage years especially, you really kinda took an interest in that, so I remember you guys used to, like, plan out the meals and, like, cook a whole, dinner,
Yep.
and it was like a
And
thing.
we had a boat, so we would go out on the boat all the
Mhm.
time together. And
Thankfully, he taught you how to drive the truck with the boat and get it on
well,
and
with the
off and
trailer and all that
trailer
stuff, yeah.
right, literally the summer before he died, you were at that age and he was teaching you because I didn't know how to do any of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it came
Uh,
in handy afterwards because then I could actually deal with all that stuff.
yeah. So, like, kind of just even going back to, like, when you were born, I just vividly have this picture in my mind of, you know, we were married 9 months when we found out we were pregnant with you. You were a surprise. I know you like to say accident, but I just don't think I it was a
It wasn't on purpose.
but it was a
You didn't
happy
want kids.
yeah,
Happy accident.
we were
Bob
not
Ross style.
we were not
Happy
planning
little
on having
accident.
children. Yeah, you were surprised and uh we were so excited though when we, found out we were having you. Um
See, that's why it doesn't stand for you to be like, this is all my problems with my body are your fault. Because it wasn't
that's
my fault.
that's
That you knew perfectly well what you were doing.
that was whole
You
different
knew the
story.
risks.
Whole different story. Um so I just remember the thing I really appreciated about your dad too is again, he always had my back. So, like, a lot of times I think people thought that he was the person who, like, decided something. A lot of times I'm the one who decided this is how I want it to be, and he was just the person that enforced it, especially
Yeah,
with
he was the enforcer.
family because my family, like, boundaries didn't exist. And, when I know that we had discussed pretty in depth that when we went into labor and we were gonna have you, that we wanted it to just be us, until we were ready to have other people meet you. Like, we didn't want to have everybody waiting outside the door for you to be born or people in the room with us because it was our family. Like, we created you. This was our little family. We wanted to experience it, by ourselves, and then invite people to, meet you as well. And I just remember like after you were born and the first time he got to hold you. I mean, you know, I think you remember your dad, he didn't get emotional super often, but when he did, um I don't know, he had tears in his eyes, like he instantly had fallen in love with you. I think he actually fell in love with you before I fell in love with you. as my child. Like, I was not one of
You're
those
like, ew, get this thing out of me.
well, everyone talks about having a baby and they're like, "Oh, it's the most magical, beautiful thing ever." And you're like instantly in love with this baby that you just, held for 9 months or you carried and now you gave birth. And I just remember it still feeling very weird and foreign and like I did not have this instantaneous connection. The funny thing for me is that every day as you continue to get older and develop your personality, the more, attached and in love I fell with you as my child. But with your dad, it was literally love at first sight. Like you could see it in his eyes. He had tears in his eyes. Like he absolutely adored you. And I think that just what you were describing too in terms of your experience growing up with him, um, just very much
Oh,
is
we
in
were
line
like
with
best
that.
friends.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
and that was with both of us. I mean, we never questioned. I think we've talked about this before. We have never questioned whether your dad loved us, whether he, any of that. I mean, we always knew that he was anything that he was struggling with. It had nothing to do with his family life or the life he lived in or us or, like we knew that that was,
His own internal demons kind of deal.
yeah, I mean, we never doubted his feelings. I never doubted his feelings about me. You never doubted his feelings about you. Um
He had some. I mean, yeah, no, of course he loved us so much, probably more than he loved himself. Um,
Definitely he loved us more than
but
he loved
I
himself.
mean, we also we also loved him so much
Oh,
for the same exact reason.
yeah. I mean, I think
Um,
your dad and I
he
accomplished
definitely had his quirks.
your dad and I accomplished what we wanted to, which was to create our own little family and to have our own little pod, um
Yeah.
and unit. And we always thought of our family as a unit. I mean, we brought you everywhere. We didn't, I don't know, you were part of the group. You were just part of our group and it was just the three of us, our little pod. And um but yeah, your
So
dad,
in terms of,
uh,
I was
he
gonna
just
say in terms of like his mental health and stuff,
yeah,
I think I don't think either of us up until kind of things started to get bad before he died. I don't think either of us really realized,
no.
what he had been going through on an internal level for a long time.
No, not at
Um,
all. Your dad was very good at well, I mean, he internalized a lot of things and is as aware of mental health stuff as I was, given the situation I grew up in. Um, there were a lot of things that I did not realize that were going on with your dad, which
yeah.
I
Well, I
still
think
struggle with to this day that I didn't see those things.
yeah, yeah. I mean, he's for one thing, like we've already talked about, kind of in depth, his social anxiety and kind of just his introverted. Not that being introverted is a bad thing, but like I don't think he was introverted because he didn't like people. I think that he was introverted
Because he
because he
had,
was so socially
mhm.
anxious that he couldn't bring himself to go through,
It wasn't
to go
fun for
through
him.
that.
He didn't enjoy
Yeah,
it. It wasn't fun. He used to say that all the time, "I don't need friends," and it's like, we're
yeah,
humans, everyone needs friends, but I think he had convinced himself that he liked to be alone, and it wasn't true, and it
right,
wasn't good for him, but that was what was comfortable for him.
right. And well, and so again, it's like there's nothing wrong with uh, you know, being more introverted, wanting to be,
Mm-mm.
more alone. But he got to a point where he was isolated,
Yes.
and like he didn't want to get to know people. He didn't want to interact with anybody outside of us.
He didn't wanna
Really,
go and do
he
anything.
yeah. I mean, he had his small little circle of like we had our family friends, his family, people that he already knew. But otherwise, like he had no desire to branch out in any capacity. Um,
Yeah, and I think
and there again, there's a difference between being so involved and invested in like your immediate family that you just don't have time for those things versus specifically not doing those things because
Yeah.
it's too overwhelming for you, and that's where he was at.
But we didn't know any of that you know, until I mean, all of that's kind of
Pretty much
started.
right before he died. Yeah.
Yeah, it started about a year and a half before he died, but we really didn't understand the gravity of what was going on with him until not like just a handful of months before he died. Not to mention that some of it we didn't even really understand until after he died. I mean, I pulled all of his records from everything, and he had started going to therapy before he died. I pulled those. That's how I found out he was diagnosed with severe social anxiety. Not just social anxiety. In the note in capital letters, it says severe social anxiety. I
Yeah,
mean,
like debilitating.
yeah, and I just remember
He was
feeling
so good at hiding it though, and
yeah,
like just who knowing, growing up with him, interacting with him, knowing who he was, it wasn't um he was very good at hiding or like internalizing, putting on kind of almost a front
yeah,
where like you would never know that he was anxious,
no,
but he was.
yeah,
Or and even or you would be able to tell that he's anxious, and he would be very so disconnected with his emotions
oh,
that he'd be like, "What are you talking about?" Like you could.
yeah,
There were days I remember coming home, especially in that last, probably a year before he died, where I remember I could feel his anxiety
yeah,
across the room, and I'd be like, "Hey, what's going on? What's wrong?"
and
And he'd be like, "What are you talking about?"
he had no concept of it.
Because it was just his normal. He just got to a point where he wasn't hiding it as well anymore.
I
You
think
know,
I mean, I have theories about that, but I do think that, like, his job and we'll talk more about this in the next episode of kind of, like, what happened with him over the years and sort of how we thought how things kinda ended up to where they did right before he died. But I think that the job that he had before he died was really good for him in a lot of ways. It was good for our family, but then also it exacerbated his social anxiety because he had to be on, like, he was with clients and customers and, always having to
he
socialize
had to
in a
take
way,
people. Yeah, he had to take people. He was kind of a salesman in a way.
sort of.
He was
And
a
need customer
supervisor, but
service.
like he had to
Yeah.
please clients is
Yeah.
basically what it came down to. So he often was taking people out to dinner and like doing company dinners
Entertaining.
and entertaining and for somebody who was very non-social, he had a very social job.
Right. And
And
I think that that's ultimately what the downfall was, is that the more he had to do that for his job, the more when he was at home, he needed to, I guess, in a sense, recharge. But because he didn't understand that about himself, he started to have some like really unhealthy habits that were not helping him recharge. They were, starting to, I think, make that cycle worse for him. And now again, hindsight 2020, you can see it so clearly when you look back. But
right.
in the time,
But in
I
the
mean,
moment, it was very difficult for us to see that. Well, and I think also just the timing of it is you and I were very, I would say, engrossed in our own stuff because you were working and you were in school
yeah, I
and
was doing nursing
you know
school. I was super
you
busy.
were working at a shelter or something
I
at
had
that
some
point.
family stuff that was going on that I was dealing with, which
Yeah.
we'll get into. But yeah, I mean, it
And then
was
I was also in school. I was also working. I was like, finishing up high school. I was also in post secondary, so I was finishing, or I was like doing generals in college. I had a job. I had a social life. So like he isolated himself by not really having anybody to hang out with outside of us. But then on top of that, we were busy all the time, and so he kind of just invested himself in working. But then
yeah,
um,
it was a
his
vicious
work was probably not very healthy for him, and so
yeah.
I think he was kind of spiraling, and we
And
weren't
I don't think
we didn't notice
I think well,
until
that's
it
not
was
true. I noticed, but also there's a part of you after you've been married a really long time when you know that there are things that are like I knew something was going on with your dad because I knew him better than anybody. I knew him inside and out. I probably knew him better than he knew himself, and I knew something was going on with your dad. However, there's a part of you when you've been married that long and you've been with someone that long and you kinda I mean, marriage is not like all an upwards trajectory. You have ups and downs and it's kind of life, right? Like, things happen and you deal with them and whatnot, and so, like, I could tell something was going on with your dad, but, like, there was this kind of mindset of, like, I just gotta get through nursing school. I just gotta deal with what's going on with me with this right now because, you know, in order for me to have this career to start financially supporting and contributing, I just gotta get through this and then like I'll help figure out what's going on with your dad when I'm done with this. Because again, I'm not thinking that
Yeah.
this is the end of it. I'm not thinking that I'm not gonna have time to figure out what's going on with him.
Right. So you kind of put, and I guess saying, we didn't notice was obviously not the right way of saying that, because we did notice something was wrong. I think you, obviously being married to him, noticed a lot sooner than I did, but
Mhm.
I ultimately ended up being the one who figured it out, because I
Well,
so
yeah.
he so well, I think we'll get into a lot of that on the next episode here, but um
Yeah, I think
yeah,
we'll
I mean ultimately he, throughout our lives, was a very he he was the best dad I could have asked for. He was a
he
very
was the best
stabilizing force.
husband.
He was awesome to everybody in his life, but he wasn't very awesome to himself.
Yeah, I don't think he
He wasn't very
realized
nice to himself, I don't think.
and not nice to himself like, just mentally in his own thought process. I don't think that I really don't think he saw people or saw himself the way that other people saw him,
Oh no. And
and
and he was very hard on himself in
mhm,
general. Like he put a lot of pressure on himself to provide and to be the man that he thought you deserved, or the father that he thought I deserved.
yeah,
He put so much pressure on himself to um be perfect in
in
a lot
some
of
ways, yeah.
ways, and ultimately, but he didn't know how to cope with all of that stress in a
No.
healthy way.
No, and it's so funny, not funny, haha, but funny, ironic that here he is married to somebody who probably knows th more than anyone at that point about mental health, given the circumstances that I grew up in and all
Anyone
the
in your
stuff I go on
lives.
anyone in my lives, right, at the time, in our lives, but, like, he was so stubborn, and I think honestly, deep down, he was afraid that that stuff might be true, and he just didn't really wanna face it or know how to deal with
Well,
it.
yeah. I mean, we had a lot of conversations, like, I think as a family, but just in general, about, you know, hey, there's something going on. Like, you need to, with him, about,
Mhm.
hey, there's something going on. Like, where, even when it came to like going to the doctor and stuff,
Oh, he was
you'd
so
point things
stubborn.
out and you'd be like, you need to go to the doctor, or
Mm-mm.
you need to, and he'd be like, well, you're making it up. It's not a big deal, whatever. Um,
You could not get
and it,
that
and
man to do anything that he did not want to do. And it did
right,
not matter. And I think
right.
a lot of that sometimes just came from probably his own fears, right? Like if I don't go to the doctor and, deal with this, then
Then I don't have to find what's
I don't
up,
I don't
find
have
out
to
what's
figure out
wrong.
what's wrong with me. Um,
Right.
but yeah, I mean, unfortunately,
Well, I think
I was gonna say unfortunately that was his demise. Hey, you know how this works.
if you like this episode, or just like us in general, you can find us at It's Going Podcast on all the things.
Don't forget to check out the links in the description.
And thanks for hanging out with us.